Today, we're really happy to have Margaret Sherraden join us. We're talking about financial capability and human services, something that intersects the school social work's work, IRP's work, and her own work. Margaret's a research professor at the Center for the Study of Social Development at Washington University in St. Louis. She's a research professor. That's a research professor. She's also a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. You're doing well. It's not my day. Trust me, I'm still not getting too much. She got a PhD in sociology from WashU, and she lives in Chicago and various other places. What she talks about and works with is equity and access to social policies, human capital building. She lists here something she's doing in Mexico, but she just came back from Colombia where she's doing other stuff. That's Carolyn Heinrich, who's evaluating Bolsa Familia in Brazil, so this is a little Latin American circle here. And she's got a number of books, Striving to Save, in particular is one with Sandra Beverly, who I knew, whose work I'd read, and so on, and one with Cynthia Sanders and some guy named Michael Sherraden, who many of you may know. Anyway, it's Margaret that's here today, and we're really happy to have her. So Margaret, go ahead. You've got an hour. We usually go to somewhere between 1:15 and 1:30, and then afterwards there's a reception for everybody, per usual. And welcome to IRP and the Center for Financial Security Services.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I said, Nancy Fulbright is downstairs. I'm going down there. She's one of the people who I love her work. So I'm sorry, actually, that I'm missing her, and you are also. It's great to be here. Of course, IRP is, one of the leading centers, and we've been following the work of IRP. Dan is an old friend from way back, and Tim as well, and it's wonderful to be here. Great programs coming out of here, and we look to your leadership all the time to sorting out the trends, what's happening, particularly with low-income families. So this is really important. And then Mike's contribution in terms of bringing in this whole question of financial literacy and financial education, and what I'll talk about today is financial capability. A really important and exciting area, both in the United States but internationally. You've heard from Anna Maria Lusardi. She's very involved now in thinking about how we're going to measure financial literacy around the world in K through 12 equivalents, and so a lot of very, very exciting stuff, but still not much research. At least not the kind of research that we feel like we hang our hats on. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here, and I have to say that when I told people I was coming to Madison, they were ready to come with me. They said, that is where it's happening, at least this last week and this week. So very exciting. I have I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground here, so I may have to flip through several slides so that we have a little bit of time for discussion. Please, I'm fine with questions as I go along. So if something is not clear, if I go a little fast or whatever, please let me know. So in this presentation, I'm gonna kind of focus on more of the conceptual. The way I think about financial capability and sort of conceptual approach. I think this is really important as we think about how we're going to develop financial capability in low-income families. What are we really talking about? Does it really respond to the needs and identified needs of low-income families? So I think it's important to be fairly clear and straight about what it is we mean. Not sure that we're quite there yet. So this is a first kind of stab at it. It's pretty intuitive, I think, but I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it. You know, social policy, of course, is kind of the subtext of all of this because we do applied work. So our goal is to really get to the point where we have some idea about what we can do from a public policy standpoint that will build financial capability in low-income households. Okay, so, oops, it disappeared.
I was gonna say, she's gonna show a film, that's okay.
Well, does anyone know a trick?
All right, technical assistance, please. Dawn went downstairs.
It's probably bumped the button.
Probably hit the wrong button. Sounds like something I would do.
It happened while she was talking.
There you go.
Magic.
Thank you.
I never call technical assistance in my classes because there's usually the youngest student who knows how to fix it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about why why I think it's important, what I mean by financial capability. The answer to that is I think it's both financial literacy and financial inclusion. I'll provide some research evidence from individual development accounts and children's development accounts, and then talk a little bit about implications for human services, and really just one slide on future research, which mostly says that we need some experimental evidence on this issue. So why I think it's important, this is a slide just full of data that basically says that things are really bad at the bottom right now and getting worse. You know, we have rising Gini coefficient index since 1993. We've seen these, you know, income falling in many households, poverty is increasing. On the wealth side, interesting figures, I think, that, you know, we know that wealth is low in the bottom half of the population, but I think if we take particularly Black and Hispanic families, I came across a piece by Rex Nutting in MarketWatch, and he had a figure which is not on here because I couldn't verify it, but then I emailed Ed Wolf and said, where did these data come from? And obviously they came from him. So the average Black family had $2,200 in 2009 compared to $6,300 net worth in 1983, inflation adjusted. So he said this is coming out in a paper at the Economic Policy Institute soon. This is 2009 data, I guess, from the Survey of Consumer Finance. Yeah, so 2009, 2,200 in net worth compared to 6,300 net
That's
worth.
what I thought you said.
Yeah, inflation adjusted. So I don't have it on the slide because I just couldn't believe that it would be that much of a decline. If we're seeing that kind of shift, you know, and certainly the economic crisis has had a lot to do with this, but we've had inequality in net worth for a long time. These data on white to non-white net worth are from the 90s and from the 1990s and still hold true, a ratio of 10 to 1. We have a real issue in particularly low-income minority households. So we see rising inequality on both the income and the asset side. So that, to me, suggests that it's really the bottom line for why I'm interested in financial capability. And you know, I think this is it's on the agenda in places like IRP and the Center for Social Development, but in terms of public policy, I would say right now it is not on the agenda. Maybe that has something to do with the protests here, but I think Dan and I were just talking. I mean, it's really rather grim, and I don't know those of you who are doing field work and are in low-income communities talking with people, there's a real sense of despair, I would say, about where they're going. So these are just a few quotes. I do mostly qualitative research, and this is not during the economic crisis, this is prior to the economic crisis, but talking to women who were saving or not saving, because some of these are controls and some of them are treatments in this experiment that we did with IDAs. And we were talking with them just sort of about, how their finances are going and, what's happening in their life and the importance of saving, because most of them had been trying to save and they had all signed up for an IDA. Some were then assigned to a control where they didn't get that. But these are the kinds of things they said. Dorothy said, I feel a little tired. I'm 58 years old. I've worked for 34 years without stopping. I don't have a pension. I have nothing. Yeah.
Does Dorothy, one of the important things the Center for Financial Security might do, does Dorothy know if she's eligible for Social Security? She has disability benefits, she's got survivor's benefits, and she ought to be able to understand that letter she gets from the commissioner every year that tells her about what her future pension rates are. So, I mean,
Yeah,
she doesn't have a
good
private pension, but
If she's on the books.
what?
If she's on the books.
As
If
soon as
she's
she
on
was
the
working
books.
on the books.
A lot of a lot of the people we talked to were not on the books. They'd been in domestic labor their whole lives, and weren't. And I think that there's something different, because we did hear from people that they knew that they could go to, and many had gone to, say, public assistance, but they didn't want to. I mean, they really wanted something that was theirs, that they had built up themselves. So Levon, she was a control. Dorothy was a participant. Levon was a control. Cynthia was a control. So Levon said, I should have money saved and in the bank. They all believe they should have savings. They've gotten that loud and clear. Nobody needs to tell poor people that they should save. They know that. She said, I shouldn't be strained up every month. It's keeping me on the lowest edge, just living paycheck to paycheck, because like I said, life, things come up, and there you are, strained up and stressed out. I thought that was just sad. Cynthia was one of our more articulate participants in this project, and she said later, nobody in government or whatever has knocked on my door and said, you want to get into the middle class? It's not fair that it's so unbalanced. The world would be a better place if we all had the same opportunities. A real sense that a lot of stuff was out of reach for her. So this is, I think, if we were talking to people now, it would be even worse, because as we know, a lot of people are doubled up. They've been thrown out of their homes. They're really strained at this point, moving kids from school to school. So I think about this, I think of these sort of two key challenges. One is the lack of essential financial knowledge and skills, which I think is what Tim was pointing to make optimal financial decisions in an increasingly complex financial landscape. I don't know about you, but I can't keep up with the financial landscape. They're 6 beats ahead of most of us, and even those of us with college educations or doctorates. But then also lack of access to beneficial financial products and services that actually contribute to financial stability and hope for the future. So the way we think about financial capability is as both an individual and a structural idea. Both the ability to act based on the knowledge and skills and confidence, motivation that a person has inside them, and the opportunity to act through access to financial services. And these aren't, it's a tall order, I would say. So the theoretical perspectives, the way I look at this is it really bridges the fields of economics and sociology, in the sense that it takes into account how individual action and social structure influence household financial management and decision making. So economic theory tells us that people know, right? They know what's best for them, and they will make the right decisions. And if they're low income, they'll have precautionary savings, those kinds of things. Behavioral economics, is huge in this field, as you well know. talking about the sort of cognitive limitations that people work with. So they're not able to actually make optimal economic choices. People, so they develop rules of thumb for managing financial behavior, mental accounting, framing. And then Thaler and Sunstein obviously have been talking about how you nudge people towards making the right decisions. So you have this quote choice architecture that kind of channels people into the right choices. And then sort of a different take on that, Simon's work obviously is that education and information and regulation will help in that case. I was sort of actually kind of confounded a little bit about where to put that piece, but it ended up on this slide. Sociology looks at this a little bit differently. It's a more structural perspective where financial action is not only a question of individual choice and behavior, but how institutions shape and constrain their options, perspectives, and actions. So for example, the way that people think about money, including the mental accounts that they may assign their money to, because people tend to think about Viviana Zelizer, she would be a great person to also bring in, to talk about, it's my PIN money, it's my college money, it's, and they have different, Rainwater did this work early on, I put this money in this pot and it's for daily emergencies, and I put other money and that's for the kids' school, and so people are physically and mentally accounting for their money. But sociologists would say that that's embedded in the social structures in which people live, how they live out their lives. And they're not in charge of how all of that is decided. So for example, racial discrimination makes certain choices impossible for people and other choices more possible. It's something outside of them, it's part of the social structure. So moving into sort of what does capability mean then? I think about capability from the standpoint of the way that Sen and Nussbaum have written about it. Sen talks about capabilities or notions of freedom in the positive sense, what real opportunities you have regarding the life you may lead. And then Nussbaum takes this, I think, for a social worker, I look more to her work. I'm really excited. She has a brand new book on capabilities just coming out right now, I think. I have an order in, but it hasn't gotten to my house yet. She talks about internal capabilities and the existing external conditions that make up a person's combined capabilities. And in her book, she talks about a whole list of sort of access to certain human rights. Financial capability is not on that list yet. Let's see how that goes. And then another person who I look at a lot in terms of what we then do and how we involve low-income populations in shaping their world is Hirschman's work in voice and influence and agency over the shape of their financial and economic well-being. A lot of times, I think I was saying this to a group of doctoral students earlier, we think we know what people's experiences are, but it's really important, I think, that we involve people in making those decisions and helping to shape those institutions. Financial capability and policy, very briefly, the first time that I found that it was used was in the UK. It was pretty much where, I don't know if you've discovered it being used in any other place, but I think it started in the UK, went to Canada, and then very recently the US government under Obama has adopted the term. But typically what they mean by financial capability is financial literacy, not changing the social institutions. They actually, the US Treasury actually says that it's important that we deal with the service side, but it's not explicit in terms of the actions that are being taken. So let's start with financial literacy. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time here. I'm not adopting this because I think it's a particularly great definition. It's just because it's out there. Knowledge, skills, confidence, and motivation to manage financial resources effectively for lifetime financial security. There are thousands of definitions of financial literacy, but you can kind of get the idea. This is what the U.S. Department of Treasury has come up with as sort of the core competencies. There are these lists abound, and you could adopt any number of them, but this is what Treasury is now trying to sort of build their programming around in financial education. And Mike's far more aware of what's happening with them than I am. But that people should have knowledge about earning, spending, saving, borrowing, and financial protection as basics, jump-off points. We know financial literacy levels are low, and this is pretty much cross-national. Not every country has done these financial literacy assessments, but most of the English-speaking world now has, among others. Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, and the results are pretty similar across those countries. But I would say that it's not, these studies really haven't been normed. They haven't, it's everybody's best guess about what to ask. Generally, I think the patterns are that numeracy is pretty low across most populations, and that people are unaware of the more complex financial instruments that are out there, but at the same time they judge their capacity as probably higher than their test score would suggest. Mike can probably add, Karen, these two are the experts on this. So it's fairly low. I think one thing to maybe point out here is that this is professionals creating a set of questions about financial literacy. As a social worker, I would suggest sort of a different way of thinking about financial literacy, and that is that probably a lot of us in this room would have a hard time making it financially on a low income. And there's a lot of poor people that do. And so what exactly is financial literacy? And I think that depends on the context in which we're asking the question. So does somebody know about, what is a 401k and how would you sign up for one? A low-income person who hadn't worked in an institution that offered that kind of benefit might not be able to answer that question. Or maybe even if they were in an institution, they do need to know about that. But they do know where they can get an emergency loan, even though it's from a loan shark, and they're going to pay a lot of money back. I mean, there's survival skills that low-income households, they are managing their finances actively all the time. So I think a lot of times policymakers have in their mind that poor people are not active financial managers. They typically know where every penny is going because there aren't that many to go around, right? They may not always be making the optimal decisions, but then neither am I. It's just that I have more cushion to make mistakes. So I think that's important to keep in mind. It's, I think, so when we're talking about financial literacy, it's not a matter of ignorance. It's a matter of exposure and access to being able to use the instruments that are going to help people move ahead. So let's turn to financial inclusion for a minute. So this is just a sort of compilation. There are many definitions of financial inclusion as well. I'm defining it as accessible, affordable, financially attractive, easy to use, appropriate, secure, and reliable financial products and services. I mean, this is what's sort of coming out of the research, that these are the characteristics that seem to make a difference. So when I'm signing up for a bank account has to be accessible, right? Has to be affordable, and for a lot of poor people it isn't because the minimum deposit is too high. Right? Has to be financially attractive, so I'm going to choose, which instrument to put it in, depending on where I'm going to get the best return. Fairly easy to use. Most of us don't do complicated financial transactions. We try to avoid that if we can, except for those who just love that stuff. Appropriate for your goals and for your life, right? Secure. Security is a bigger issue internationally and in less developed countries where the inflation that may happen, the devaluation that may occur tomorrow, makes your money in the bank really, really vulnerable. But I think the last couple of years have showed us that secure places to have money is not just a given in this country either. And reliable, that you know what is going to happen to your funds. So we have large numbers of unbanked households. This is all probably review for most of you. A quarter of low-income U.S. households have neither a checking or a savings account. Racial and ethnic minorities, unmarried heads of household, young people with less formal education, lower income, and lower assets are overrepresented among the unbanked. And the unbanked, we stop right there. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday about branch banks closing and disproportionately in poor neighborhoods. An issue if we're trying to reach out to people who are not in banking relationships. And as a result, what happens in low-income households, what we found in our study of Striving to Save was that people are in both. They have a foot in both mainstream banking relationships and alternative financial institutions. So these alternatives, sometimes called predatory, sometimes called fringe banking, operate outside of federally insured banks and thrifts. This is an FDIC definition. Check cashing outlets, pawn shops, payday loans, etc. I have a great story about a rent-to-own place in town, I'll tell you. Pyramid schemes, I used to think that was mostly in other countries too until Bernie came along. But then, interestingly, we see in alternatives, we see kind of a blurring of the boundaries between mainstream and alternatives with things like mobile banking and web-based peer-to-peer lending. So programs like Kiva, where you can fund people for their small business. I mean, these are really not regulated under, mainstream banking, but they hopefully are not the kind of predatory lending mechanisms that have occurred with that sort of middle group. So there's this kind of blurring of the boundaries between mainstream and alternatives. Ultimately, neither of these sectors is meeting the needs of low income. This would be my contention: low income and financially vulnerable families. And Michael Barr has written about this. So let me stop and see if there's any questions so far.
What's a ROSCA?
Oh, sorry, Rotating Credit Savings and Credit Associations. So people who get together, this is very, very common in other countries, but in immigrant communities in this country, they'll get together and we'll all put money in 1 month, and you get it this month, and then the next month you get it. So in other words, you can be saving a fairly small amount of money, but then get a cash infusion at one time. And there are all kinds of variations on ROSCAs. Yeah.
I'll just, I've always been curious why financial literacy doesn't connect more with reading literacy. Because they've debated the same issue of, is it just reading words or is it being able to function? And so, the same debates are going on. And just in talking and thinking about it as in your slides, one of the reasons people can't answer questions is they can't read. the words. So in order to answer a question correctly about 401Ks, you need to know what 401Ks are. And so a lot of the reading, the financial literacy is presuming a level of knowledge initially that we're not testing for. And so I think one of the reasons why we have these abysmal scores is that people were asking questions about concepts that are not relevant in their lives.
That's a really good point. I mean, I can't understand the disclosure statements.
Right, but if you don't even know what disclosure statements are.
But if you don't even know what
right,
that is, and you can't read the
can't-
word.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. So I don't think we think enough about the reading literacy that is required in financial literacy tests or, educational material.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this is one thing that Jean Hogarth is working on a lot.
Right.
And so I'm sure she'll talk about that when she comes, trying to figure out, it's complicated too, right? How do you write this stuff so that real people can actually read it and understand? Yeah, and then if they can't read at all, I mean.
Well, that's it,
Yeah.
right. But we should be separating that out,
Yeah.
people who don't know about financial literacy versus people who don't know how to read these questions.
Right. And, a lot of the financial literacy work that's being done around the world, they are working actually with populations that don't read and write, and so a lot of it, they're trying to get across these concepts through drawings and acting, and there's a lot of curricula that's sort of trying to develop those approaches. It's really tough. Okay, so I'll just turn now for a few minutes to just look at some of the evidence. This is from our work in savings, so this is more on the savings side, but there's other great work happening on the credit side and with other aspects. But saving has gotten a lot of attention, and we've been particularly interested in looking at how to build assets in low-income families. This is a lot of my husband's work. So IDAs, or individual development accounts, are designed build financial capability. These are special accounts, savings accounts, they could be started as early as birth. That's actually the idea. The original idea is that they would be started at birth. Along with an identity, you get a savings account, something that a lot of the world doesn't have, either the identity, official identity, and certainly not the savings account. Savings are matched, or there's some kind of subsidy for low income or cap. Usually multiple sources of matching savings deposits with financial education, and typically for some kind of long-term investment purpose, homes, some kind of business, home repair, education. So the research that I'm going to talk about is from the American Dream demonstration, which happened from 1997 to 2001, research through 2009 with a follow-up in 2005 and follow-up in 2009. There were 14 program sites, one experimental site, which was in Oklahoma, and it was a mixed method approach. So the participants in AD saved, there were 2,300 working poor adults. These are all people at baseline under 150% of poverty, $16.60 average monthly net deposit. There were a lot of different ways that they counted how much people had saved. This is the one that seemed to be sort of the richest dependent variable to look at. 52% were, quote, savers. That means that they had, they finished up with at least $100 in their account. So basically what happened with AD was that 48% didn't save, or didn't save over any period of time. So a lot of people use the account as a transaction account. So when you looked at the withdrawals, there were like many withdrawals. So it was interesting for me when I was doing in-depth interviews to then look also at their account activity, and you could see what was happening. But about 52% were considered, quote, savers. It was a low bar for savers. The savings among the savers was $32. So you can see half did what they saved, they really saved. They did twice twice the average monthly net deposit of the sample overall. Typical savings match, although not every program had the same savings match, was 2 to 1. Each dollar that could be matched, that was made available for matching, 42 cents was used. So again, if you just looked at savers, that number would go way up. And home purchase, home repair was the most popular use. So here are the experimental results. I'll do my best to because I was not working on this part of the project. To summarize this, in wave 3, the biggest impact was home ownership. 7 to 11 percentage points, I guess, depending on how they calculated it. This is Greg Mills and Bill Gale and others who did this. Yeah. So home ownership impact was the biggest outcome. In wave 4, 2009, there was a interestingly, because this is after the economic crisis, there was a continued growth in home ownership in both groups. Through 2009, after the experiment ended, the controls caught up with the IDAs, with the treatments. So the descriptive results show that among the treatments, home ownership was up 31 percentage points, and controls, home ownership up 25.8. So the way that this ended up was that there was no significance on home ownership in the follow-up, but in the sample above the median income of 16,000, actually there was a significant difference still with treatment and controls. I think that part of the reason that there was a continued increase and that these families did not probably lose as many of their homes as in other low-income communities was that in Tulsa there's a fairly developed home ownership support network, which would suggest that some of Mike's work in terms of the guidance and the coaching and helping people pick out the right loan products actually did make a difference, but not only among the treatments but among the controls, because you can't control the controls. They found programs where they bought homes. So that work is not yet published, but it will be soon, I think. Grinstein Weiss is the lead author on that. Yeah.
Is the stable fairly sample in the sense that you didn't lose many of your controls and attrition afterwards? Because that could, maybe impact too the differentials.
They had an 80% response rate, which is really good after a decade.
Relatively non-random attrition.
Yeah. And they controlled for it. They did a lot of analyses. I think a lot of this is in the paper. Did a lot of controlling for differences. Sorry.
This may be like an overly cynical way to look at that, but is it possible that because the requirements to get a mortgage were so much more relaxed in sort of the second half of what you're looking at, that people who maybe weren't savers were able to get a mortgage easier than they would have in the beginning of your study, or am I looking at the dates wrong?
It was relatively easy to get a mortgage in much of that.
Okay.
Yeah. When you say that? Yeah. So it was pretty relaxed, although there was a period where they were just giving them away, practically forcing them on you. Second mortgages anyway. Not so much the first mortgages, but second mortgages.
Because all the treatment and controls were people who came into a social service agency, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Could part of the treatment for both of those groups been that they would have gotten better access to banking services? So that one of the reasons why the effects are not so big is that they were both more prone to be unbanked, and by coming into the social service agencies and being in this experiment, they were, in fact, had greater access. Only one group had access to the matching
Right, the treatments definitely had greater access,
Right.
because when they set up an IDA, they took them down to the bank and opened the account,
Right,
right? So,
but the controls would have as well in terms of coming in and accessing the service of the community agency. Right?
yeah, yeah, I mean, there's sort of
So-
two issues here. I mean, one is, I don't know what the controls, you know, whether that would have made them more likely to also open an account, just coming in. But I mean, what you're referring to is really critical, and this is what's so hard when you're doing social experiments, right? Is that, you know, it's not a random group of people that are coming in to the whole program. They're people who are seeking out an IDA, and some get assigned to the IDA and some get assigned to the control. So they are going to be one would hypothesize, they will be a more motivated group
Right, 'cause I've
altogether.
always thought, you know, even if the effects are small, then in some ways this isn't, you know, the world as it was versus the American dream, or but a group of people that have access to community services, they're coming into a community agency who's providing them the systems, and it might be some in there would actually instruct them on how to open a bank account.
Absolutely, and it's very likely that, you know, those of you who work with low-income people, they access services in one agency, they're looking for other options too, they're not without
So this could be
resources.
impressive.
Yeah, I
In
mean,
some ways.
Was this explicitly this experiment tied to home ownership? Because one of the things that I used to tell your husband and everyone else is that home ownership is way out there, pensions are way out there.
right,
No one's willing to subsidize precautionary savings, for instance.
right, right.
And that could be more important in terms of the sequence of particularly low-income people.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with you more. I mean, one of in our book and in our interviews with people, and I'll get to this finding in a minute, one of the issues is that there's got to be a backup. There's just got to be a backup. I mean, if you're going to have long-term savings, there have to be emergency savings somewhere. You know, how we structure that, I'm not quite sure. You know, we probably need to try some things, see what works. But people have to have a backup. There's a bunch of stuff that sort of has to be in place. But that is, I totally agree with you.
But these funds were limited in what they could be used for.
Yes.
I mean, the matching.
Yes, and that's
What they could
probably
be
why
used
we
for.
see a home ownership effect, is
Right.
because that was one of the main
It was.
ones. And, you know, low-income families really do want to own their own home. I mean, and they had a lot of really good reasons for owning their own home. Like, some of them wanted to start their own business in their own home. They wanted to have a daycare business. Things that are really difficult when you're dealing with a landlord. So there were good reasons. But some of the older adults really wanted to have their own place because they wanted to be able to take care of their grandkids and, you know, have a place, a stable place for them to be. There were a lot of stories to sort out. But another interesting finding here is that financial education, the research shows or suggests that it really does matter. So among the savers, the first 10 hours of financial education was positively associated with savings, with no relationship after 10. So it looked like that whatever was in the 10 hours, and we have some idea, but not a great idea, because you come back to being in the classroom to know what they were receiving, but it seemed to make a difference. So each of the first 10 hours is associated with an increase in $1.16. Therefore, 10 hours is associated with an increase of $11.60 per month, or $139 a year, which would be matched, if it's 2-to-1 match, by $418 and $1,670 over 4 years. So if you want to try to monetize the contribution of financial education in this case, this would be a starting point. I think this is kind of what we need to try to be able to do, is to figure out what is the independent contributions of various aspects of the program. So from the qualitative research, 2/3 of the participants described the IDA program as, in one form or another, an opportunity. A blessing, a head start, a stepping stone. I mean, they had a lot of different ways. Some of them said they thought Ed McMahon had arrived at their doorstep. They had a lot of colorful ways of talking about the IDA. And they compared it to the welfare department, in pretty unfavorable terms for welfare. I mean, they just said that it felt to them like the IDA was helping them get ahead. And they did not feel that way about public assistance. A lot of that had to do with the personnel and the roles. They described being yelled at, screamed at, made to feel terrible by public assistants, whereas the people in the IDA program were saying, we're going to match your money 2 to 1. I mean, it's a whole different kind of thing. This is something you want to do, a goal you have, we're going to help you get there. So Fred, these are all obviously pseudonyms, said the IDA's developed, so we asked them, well, what's this program about? What does it do? He said, it's developed to get you back on track, get you going back up the ladder. The IDA program is developed to get you back to saving to accomplish some of your goals. That was a pretty common theme that we heard from them. So IDAs seem to guide, encourage, compel, and shape participants' action towards saving. So how does that happen? A savings match attracts people to the program. So when we said, well, why did you take notice? They said, who's going to pass up a match? It suddenly became worthwhile to save, said one person. The savings match cap becomes a savings target. This is actually really interesting. I think I have some of the data on this. A pretty interesting finding that we found both qualitatively and they also found quantitatively is that when you said to people you have $750 a year that will match, okay? They didn't see that as something to bump their head against. It wasn't a limit. It became their goal. So they worked hard, and one person said, if I didn't do that, it'd be like throwing $750 away. So the match cap, this is savers again. For savers, a $1 increase in the monthly match cap was associated with an increase in monthly net IDA savings of 57 cents. So people really tried to reach that. So we're thinking now, when we're setting up savings programs, that one of the things that we'll probably want to do is have people identify what their goal is, what their target is, and set that at the beginning of the program and get people to try to reach that goal. Rules, they love the rules. They love the fact that they were supposed to put a certain amount in every month. They love the fact that they couldn't just reach in their pocket and get that money. They said, if that money's sitting around home, somebody's going to borrow it, my husband's going to come take it, my kids are going to ask for it. It's really good that it's in the bank. It helps them focus on what they have to do. They like the staff support and the reminders. I missed the FERS part on that. This is high-touch stuff. It's expensive. So one of the challenges for savings programs is to figure out how to reduce those costs and to develop reminders and support for people that is not human or immediately human, because that's expensive. As well as financial education. So we need to think about how we're going to, and then Mike's thinking hard about how to do this, to build financial education into, say, social services where they're interfacing with, and it's happening, not necessarily in the IDA program. Yeah.
Besides the staff support, did anybody mention group support of other people doing the savings?
It was variable. Now, this is the qualitative research. This is one of the, actually for the doctoral students, we're just talking about this. This was a pattern we were really having a hard time with, because some people hated financial ed and the group stuff. They said, I know how to do this. I don't want to have to go to financial ed. I do not find it useful to be with a group of people. And then other people said, I felt so much better knowing that other people were having trouble saving. And so I think this is a matter of figuring out how we're going to target the right groups with the right kinds of services. not so easy, but maybe it's probably best to leave it up to them. I mean, that would be where I would start, is like, what do people say they need, you know, like,
So one comment, one question. So for anybody who went to John Zimman's talk last semester, he talked about the barriers, or how do we help the poor save, and what are the, it's remarkably similar to what you've just put up here. He said, from a behavioral economics frame, things like reminders and constraints, and so there's a lot of parallels between what you see and what you said you're raising. My question is about to what extent do these folks who are engaged in public services and public systems know the rules about asset limits? Are they keenly aware of the fact that if I have so much money, I might get kicked out of food stamps or something?
absolutely, absolutely. And,
And
you
are
know,
they correct? I mean, do they know, are they technically correct about what those amounts are?
oh, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think so. One woman, I actually write about her fairly extensively because it's just so sad. She moved to California, and she raised a kid. She had a pretty good job, so she'd actually been working in a credit union, and so she saved some money. She bought a house. Her kid had stayed back in Oklahoma and had 5 kids, and ended up in all kinds of trouble, and then landed in prison. So she had to move back to Oklahoma, and she went to get some public assistance for the kids, and they said, you have to spend all your money before we're going to give you a cent. So she lived off of her savings. You know, she was an older woman at that point. It was not that easy to get a job, certainly not a good job. And she had to spend down everything. And I don't know what the exact rules are in Oklahoma, probably not that liberal, so.
Well, yeah,
Kim?
28 states now, as of last year, have no financial assets test in food stamp or SNAP, the biggest program, $77 billion this year, 1 in 4 kids in America, and so forth. So in your future work, it may be of interest to know, are they aware that if I went to the SNAP people or the food stamp people 2 years ago and that's bad, are they aware, how do they become aware of how
Of
the
the
rules
changes.
change? Because that's, many of us for years have been saying that one hand, we get this whole group of people who want people to save, and on the other hand, we're saying you're not eligible for anything if you do save.
Right.
And it's still an SSI, Medicaid, those are still issues.
Right.
But SNAP turned that around now, and it really would be interesting, probably because of the recession, to see if there was a way of testing whether people knew about it.
Right. Well, this was pre-SNAP,
Yeah,
but yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's critical because the public policy context is changing all the time, that information get out to people. And they often don't hear from the workers, from the caseworkers. They're supposed to tell the clients, but you know, they don't always do that. I mean, Wisconsin probably have more training on caseworkers than they do in Oklahoma. Certainly than in Missouri. I'm very familiar with Missouri. But yeah, I mean, that has to be part of the education. I think I'll just skip through this. This is the school-based college savings program, and this was a quasi-experimental design. Basically, showed that that these little kids love money, so they had a little after-school financial education program, and they became incredibly fluent in economic terms. I mean, they could talk about opportunity costs and all kinds of things, which was, you know, at least, I mean, at the very least, they weren't afraid of these terms and thinking about economic concepts, which I thought was just really exciting. But they also had a savings account. This was part of SEED, which was a large national program. It's not a national program, it was a bunch of demonstrations around the country, but different than a national program. But the kids also thought more and talked more about college, which was interesting because they knew they had this college savings accounts, and the teachers were talking about it in that way. But there were a lot of shortcomings to the program. Chief among them is that when you're doing a research project like this in schools, in lower income communities, there's a lot of transients. So kids are in and out of those schools, so that by the time we got to 4th grade, you know, we'd lost almost half the kids who had started in kindergarten. So then we had a whole non-study population, which was kind of interesting. So the results of our, when we gave the financial fitness for life test in 4th grade, it was pretty interesting that the treatments did the best, and then the comparison group did the next best because they'd been in the same school. They were the 2 grades ahead of them. And then the non-study population did a little bit less well. So, you know, it came out the way we thought it would, and there were significant differences across these groups. But anyway, I won't go into detail with that. But it was fun to work with little kids, and they understand a lot more than people think they do about economics or can. Okay, but saving in, this gets back to your point, I think, Tim, that everyday financial demands and emergencies make it difficult to save, particularly for that non-saver group, the half of that group that was in the IDA program. Debt obligations, but especially medical debt. Unless we figure out what to do about health care, none of this stuff's going to work. Nothing. I mean, there were people in these interviews who owed up to $90,000. It's like, you know, from a public policy standpoint, when we're faced with that kind of thing, if we can't make this health thing stick, there's sort of no point. Difficult to resist spending. We all know that it is difficult. So we have problems with self-control. That's what the behavioral economists tell us. So in other words, despite these helpful features, saving in an IDA takes initiative, it takes determination, it takes motivation, it takes self-control. And it falls somewhere between sort of discretionary saving and contractual saving. So you've got a contract to save, you've got an obligation supposedly to put in $10 a month, right? And you have these incentives to do it. But it's not the same as my 401k. But if I have a 401k. It's not like it happens automatically, and I don't have to think about it every month. And my employer is putting a match, right? So, Cynthia, she was a control. She said, she talked about this a lot. She said, we need more keys. We need more information. We need more tools put in our hand. Don't just tell me you need to save, or are you saving? Help me, show me the arena, give me access to the arena. She was interesting because she worked as a domestic housekeeper for some pretty wealthy people. And they had talked to her about, you know, investing and stocks and bonds, and you know, they've been trying to educate her about what she might do with her life. So
I
she,
hope they paid her Social Security.
I doubt it. But she, you know, she understood that there was this other world out there that she didn't have access to. And I think unlike a lot of low-income families who just say, that's their world. This is my world. I know how to operate in my world. And that world is not the world that we're in. They see it as separate. She was able to see it. And I think that's why she was so articulate about what was not available to her. So in terms of financial literacy, and I'll draw this to a close here, developmental approach, you guys have written about this, across the life course, foundation of financial knowledge in schools. I mean, this just seems, I know there's a lot of debate about whether we should do financial education in schools, but there's certainly some basics that we could be teaching across the board. Targeting financial education to important life milestones and also to vulnerable groups. Certainly mass public education hotlines and websites, and there's a lot of development in that area already, but people don't necessarily know which are the places to go. Mike was telling me about New Zealand government's initiative in this area. It'd be interesting to look at. sharing the cost across sectors. And Jean Hogarth talks a lot about this, using the appropriate teaching methods, culturally competent, experiential, that makes sense to people in their context. And then guidance for vulnerable, particularly vulnerable groups. I mean, there are going to be always a certain proportion of the population that need a lot more hand-holding. They need a mentor, they need a coach, they need some kind of more in-depth and more expensive assistance. They're getting it right now, actually. They're getting, not necessarily the financial coaching, they're getting the help a lot of times. I think this is your point. But the people who are helping them are not really trained to help them with those financial decisions. For financial inclusion, we need to design and test financial products, especially for low-income populations, including sort of the basic things that we talked about a minute ago. We think about this not just in terms of tweaking and gimmicks. I mean, it's one thing to have a lottery feature. I know Tufano, Peter Tufano has a project. It's great. I mean, it actually looks like it might work. We're doing some work with youth savings, and we think a lottery feature would be really attractive to youth because they like things like that. But I think it's important to think about how we sort of structure the whole institution. That people have access to information, that they have incentives. I mean, all these things are set up right now for upper income people. People like me have access to tax benefited savings products of various kinds. I get to reap the benefits of being a homeowner and getting that interest deduction. I get to reap the benefits of having a pension, which also has those advantages. And low-income people get the opposite. They get told that if they save, that will be subject to an asset test if they want to seek public assistance. So I would just say that we have set up the rules, for two different groups in two different ways, and that means real changes in the way that we organize these institutions. So I'm going to end with this. So this is sort of the way I think about. Let's put the whole thing on here. Okay, so where did something come? So financial education and guidance, and financial literacy leading to financial capability, but then we need those products and financial inclusion, and that in the end, if it's not really improving financial stability and well-being and financial development, so not just stability, but what is my future going to be like? Are there going to be options for my kids? Then unless we're doing that, then I'm not sure that's what we ought to be trying for. I think we need to really think about, is this going to help people get where they want to go? I think that's what Sen and Martinez are writing about. We don't really know if these lines are right or not. And so what I would say is that we have a huge research agenda to figure out what does lead to what and which parts of these make the most difference, because there's not going to be a lot of money to do this, and we have to be as careful with how we spend our money, get the most bang out of our buck, if we're lucky to get any at this stage, to try to bring families in to the end. So this would be, I think we just need a lot more experimental research that sorts out which parts of this equation are the most important and where we can put those resources. So thanks, you've been very patient, and I'll take questions,
Please.
if there are any.
Well, mine's actually just a comment. It seems to me that the feature of the program targeting children where early on in early grades you tell them you can have opportunity to save for college. It's brilliant in the sense of not just, changing their expectations, right? Early expectations that something could be a goal for you and attainable, because I'm just curious to know how, was that just one pilot, or is this a program that's being tried in other places?
Yeah,
or-
that was just one pilot. We would, we would love to do that on a large scale.
Yeah.
But there certainly was a suggestion in a very small, we had 72 kids, in a small pilot, that it did make a difference, and that kids could articulate. It was really interesting. They could articulate their different trajectories. Some kids, because it was kind of a bimodal group. We had a group that was pretty well off, and then we had a group that was pretty not well off. And the kids who grew up around the dinner table talking about college, or their parents went to college, they were very conversant about what they wanted to do, what their career was and stuff. And the kids that weren't, some of them even articulated that. They would say, they'd say, oh yeah, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to go. But then you get into the discussion a little bit more, and they would start to waver, and they'd say, well, it depends. My mom says it depends on whether we have the money. Once a 6-year-old gets the message that it depends on the money, and they know that there are discussions in the household all the time about making ends meet, put 2 and 2 together. They're not stupid, right? They figure out that maybe this isn't going to work out. So yeah, I think it's really critical, and that's why we want to do savings at birth. That's another whole discussion. Yeah.
Well, I'll push an article that is actually about to
Please
come
do.
out with Chuck Kalish, who he and I looked at the psychological literature on children's cognitive development, and basically to say, when can they learn different financial concepts. And it is remarkable in the financial literature. In the psychological literature, there's a lot of reference to when kids can understand quantities, when they can understand differences between size and value, and when they can understand the future, and so we sort of put that all together to conclude what really financial literacy, that there should be financial education, from very young, for very young children, but relative to their cognitive development stages.
Oh, I'd be very interested in looking.
But I was also going to bring up something else in connection with institutions, actually, and which is a question about to what extent did you involve institutions? And the reason I ask this is because I have been involved in developing a video that should be coming out by Sesame Street on savings for children.
Oh, that's great.
And when we were talking about it, how do you present this? They want to target very low income families, and how do you present savings? And we would talk about banks. And the issue was, well, if you talk about banks to a lot of families, first of all, they don't have access, but they cannot have access. There is a bank that is financing this video, and I was sort of shocked, but they said, yes, that's right. We know how to screen families, and we will not open banks for certain accounts for certain people. It's not this that you have to educate people about banking, but you have to say, here's a bank, but the institutions have to be altered, that are unbanked are becoming more and more people that are being refused access. And so I guess the question is, to what extent, maybe there should be an experiment that assigns banks to show them that the costs are not so
Force them to take
great.
those families
Right,
and see what
because
their
that
bottom
is,
line.
they said we cannot talk about banks because people have terrible experiences with banks.
They do.
Yeah,
Terrible.
right, and so it's not just, getting them to save. It's-
Not at all.
Right.
This is, do you know that Harris Trust has a student-run bank in South Division High School in Milwaukee? I saw it. $300,000 deposit, it's just whatever. Okay. That school's a disaster. That school's got like 10% going to college and whatever. I don't know where the $300,000 came from. What it is they were learning and not learning. Certainly they weren't learning that, if you overdraw, it's much more expensive if you overdraw once than if you go to the payday lender, and so forth and so on. So I think this is very interesting. Do you know more about this? The idea of financial education by, here's a student-run bank. You have somebody like Harris
provide the
Trust
institution.
who's willing to put a person there. There were a couple of
That's
teachers.
exactly.
Yeah,
I
And in
mean,
some ways, the ADD did that they, or AD, yeah, did that, you know,
Right.
they facilitated the
Absolutely.
access to banking.
Absolutely.
And
That's
I don't
why we think
I don't
facilitation
think
is so
we-
important.
We spend enough time thinking about changing the institutions,
Absolutely.
especially the private ones. You know, we talk a lot about changing the social service institutions.
Right.
I had a question about the 10 hours of financial literacy training. How was that, I wonder if you could just talk more about that. I'm not knowing anything more than just 10 hours. It occurred to me that 10 hours is basically a day, which meant an individual has to take a day off of work. Or even if it was split up into sessions, an individual has to take time to get to the session and back. And so, just not really knowing anything more about it than what I just saw on the slide, that 10 hours itself is actually not a lot of time with which to convey information. And yet, at the same time, it's a tremendous investment for that individual in terms of some, the things that they can't do otherwise. And so,
And
the
to the
fact that there
program.
wasn't any benefit of more than 10 hours, is that actually a reflection of the training that went on, or a reflection of what the individual had to, give up in order to go?
I don't think we know the answer to that question. What we do know is everybody was required to go to financial education. So that result is just looking at the data and seeing, these correlations. Do we know
Or was it
much?
were there 2-hour sessions or 5-hour sessions and they had to go to 2 or, how
Oh,
did that
yeah,
work?
these were mostly, I think they had 6 sessions up to 2 hours, something like that. Yeah, they would never do it in a whole day because low-income people don't have a whole day, right? But, yeah, I mean, we know very little other than what I just told you. Other than, people's interpretations about the financial ed, which really ranged from, it was great, it saved my life, to it was a total waste of time. Which is why I said I think that probably we need to do a better job of targeting, right?
I mean, it just occurs to me that relates to other forms of skills training, in terms of what individuals gain from that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they could have been doing job training and we've gotten the same results, but we don't know the answer. But that's why I say we need more research that would actually monitor what the ingredients were that went into that. Yeah.
so I'll let Mike have the last word here, but is there one more question before? I mean, the cookies are there, they're not gonna go stale in 2 minutes. Mike, I guess the floor is yours.
I was going to say first thanks, because I think that a lot of folks in our field tend to think about products and they think about behaviors, and you're sort of saying that's not enough. They coexist, and the behavior doesn't make sense unless it's thinking of product, and the product doesn't make sense unless it's thinking of behavior. And I think oftentimes we have people who are in one camp or the other. So you've done a nice job of bringing them together. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
So I guess my question is,
Oh, yeah.
looking forward, what do you see as the real opportunities? Where are the good research opportunities or the good policy program opportunities that we should be thinking about over the next 2-3 years?
That's a really good question. How about domestic violence?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that that one of the nice things about this whole field is that it does sort of have, in the political and policy realm, has bipartisan support. Everybody sort of seems to think that financial education is a good
Produce
idea.
economic independence.
Yeah, right. Self-sufficiency, all of these
Yes.
kinds of. As a social worker, I cringe because I think about, that not only do people behave, but they act without actually behaving. Things happen to people because they're in certain kinds of institutions. What I would say is that, there's a lot of interest in this. I think a lot of politicians are interested. If we can wrestle there may be no budget at all. Looks like Washington, maybe Madison, then Washington. You'll lay the groundwork for not having a budget agreement, which we might look forward to. But,
You may look forward to that, but you can still for research and time.
yeah. But you know, I think that if we can work, what I would say is it's just really important to think about the institutional side of things. And we're getting that on the regulatory side, I think. And the banks are really nervous about it, of course. But I think we have to also think about how we're going to interpret the needs and requirements of low-income families in this discussion. And that it's not good enough to just sort of throw a curriculum at people that is irrelevant to their lives, even if we think it's really good for them, you know, because it's not going to work.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much.